As you know, Mr. Mystery isn't afraid to delve into hot-button topics. And what could be hotter than the threat of nuclear annihilation? Today, I'm going to delve into an area that many Americans don't even realize exists. That's because the federal government moves heaven and earth to hide the fact that its nuclear weapons stockpile is anything but 100% safe. Now, I'm not talking about terrorists stealing a nuclear bomb, nor am I rattling my saber about untold amounts of nuclear waste that are stored haphazardly all over this great nation of ours. What I'm here to point out is that since the 1950s, there have literally been hundreds of incidents where our nuclear weapons have either been dropped, blown up, or even lost by the U.S. military. The problem is so common that the government has even coined a phrase for this kind of incident. It's called a broken arrow. Almost as soon as the United States acquired the ability to create a bomb with the power to take out a city, it started having mishaps with them. Even before we dropped the first atom bomb on Hiroshima, the Los Alamos technician entrusted with the bomb's core saw the need to arm the device only after takeoff, since he realized if the Enola Gay crashed, the resulting nuclear explosion would have wiped out the airbase along with everybody else on the island of Tinian. Fortunately for the technician and his aircrew, the bomber managed to lumber into the air on August 6, 1945. Less than 5 years later, on February 14, 1950, a Convair B-36 didn't fare quite as well. While en route from Alaska to Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas, the bomber crashed in British Columbia. Before ejecting from the stricken bomber, the crew managed to jettison the Mark IV nuclear bomb it was carrying into the Pacific Ocean. The bomb, which was never recovered, contained uranium as well as 5,000 pounds of high explosives. Less than 2 months later, on April 11th, a B-29 laden with a nuclear weapon crashed into a mountain near Albuquerque, New Mexico. 3 months after that, on November 10th, a U.S. B-50 bomber jettisoned its Mark IV bomb over the St. Lawrence River near Quebec, Canada, when the bomber experienced engine trouble. Now, you'd think with 3 incidents involving atomic bombs in 1 year, this would have caused the American public to demand some changes in the policy that allowed them to be flown over our country and those of other friendly nations. Well, you'd be wrong. That's because the American public had no idea that the crashes had even occurred. You heard me right. Those in power decided to withhold this information from the public at large. As far as the Air Force was concerned, keeping the country safe from the Red Menace was worth a few incidents. Unfortunately, these were hardly the last. On March 10, 1956, a bomber carrying 2 nuclear bomb cores were lost over the Mediterranean Sea. And by lost, I'm speaking literally, since no trace of the plane or its ordnance was ever found. The flight had originated in Florida and was supposed to land in Morocco. It completed an initial mid-air refueling over the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, the bomber failed to rendezvous with a second tanker that was supposed to refuel it again over the Med. To this day, the Department of Defense has no idea where the bomber or its deadly payload came down. 4 months later, on July 27th, another incident involving a B-47 occurred over England. Not only did this bomber crash, but the aircraft happened to have the bad luck to come down atop a storage facility that housed 3 additional nuclear bombs. Air Force investigators who were summoned to the scene later concluded that it was a miracle that none of the Mark VI nuclear bombs had exploded. Another broken arrow that occurred a year later, a bomber transporting a nuclear bomb to Kirtland Air Force Base had an incident while on final approach to Albuquerque when it inadvertently dropped its bomb. The reason I say inadvertently was that the bomb wasn't just dropped, it literally crashed through the closed bomb bay door to create a 25-foot wide crater in a field near the airport. Fortunately, the only fatality was a cow that had been grazing nearby. 2 months and 6 days later, a cargo plane carrying 3 nuclear bombs from Dover, Delaware, was forced to jettison 2 of them over the Atlantic when the plane lost power. Neither of the bombs was ever recovered. On February 5th of the following year, a B-47 carrying a Mark 15 bomb collided with an F-86 fighter plane over Georgia during a training exercise. The crew of the bomber requested and was given permission to jettison its bomb over Wassaw Sound near Savannah. To this day, there lies an armed hydrogen bomb with a potential blast radius of 4 miles somewhere just off the Georgia coast. A little more than a month after this incident, another one occurred over Georgia when a B-47 took off from Savannah. The bomber pilot, Captain Earl Kohler, noticed a red light on his panel indicating the bomb harness locking pin was no longer engaged. He sent a crew member back to assess the situation. However, instead of fixing the problem, the crewman inadvertently pulled the emergency bomb release, which, you got it, dropped the H-bomb through the closed bomb bay doors. A family of 6 was injured when their home was leveled by the blast. They later sued the government and were awarded $54,000. Later that same year, another bomb was released, this time over Mars Bluff, South Carolina. The blast damaged buildings and injured 6 people on the ground. While neither caused a nuclear explosion, the government later admitted there was significant radioactive contamination released at both sites. By 1960, when the B-52 replaced the B-47, there were a few other incidents. You see, the early model of the B-52 had several congenital defects that caused the tail to sometimes break off. On January 24, 1961, a B-52 laden with up to 4 hydrogen bombs broke up in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Before it hit the ground, the crew managed to release 2 of the bombs. One of them was later found to have activated 3 of 4 arming mechanisms. Years later, one of the men tasked with recovering the bombs said, "Until the day I die, I'll never forget hearing my sergeant say, 'Lieutenant, I found the arm safe switch.' 'Great,' I said, to which the sergeant replied, 'Not great, sir. It's on arm.'" The second bomb dropped by that same B-52 plopped down in a muddy field. Instead of digging it out, the decision was made to leave the device buried in place. The Army Corps of Engineers then constructed a 400-foot wide circular concrete dome to make sure nobody would ever be able to dig it up. During the 1960s, the U.S. experienced several embarrassing incidents that contaminated several Allied nations, including one in Palomari, Spain, when a hydrogen bomb rained down plutonium over a mile-wide area. This forced the U.S. government to scrape up some 1,400 tons of contaminated soil, which it then shipped to a storage facility. Now, I'm not saying we were the only nuclear power to experience broken arrows. The Soviet Union also had its share, although most of them have yet to be revealed. One well-known incident was the 1968 sinking of a Gulf-class ballistic missile submarine 750 miles northwest of Oahu. This was the same sub the CIA later tried to scoop up from the seabed with the Glomar Explorer in 1974. The latest was the loss of the nuclear missile sub Kursk. The U.S. also lost 2 nuclear subs, the first being the nuclear attack submarine in Thresher that sank with all hands in 1963, and the second was the Scorpion that sank in 1968. Then there was the time we tried to nuke Little Rock, Arkansas. While I could go on and on about broken arrows that occurred in the air and on the sea, one of the most unusual literally happened underground. On September 19, 1980, a Titan II missile with a 9-megaton warhead exploded inside its underground silo in Damascus, Arkansas. The incident began when a 2-man maintenance crew accidentally dropped a tool they were using to service the missile. The 5-pound socket fell 8 stories before ricocheting off a fairing, only to punch a hole in the side of the rocket. Instead of admitting to their error immediately and putting the base on alert, the 2 teenage technicians kept mum for more than an hour, by which time the silo was full of explosive vapors. It isn't certain that the revelation of this omission right away would have made a difference in the final outcome, but one thing was for sure. By the time the silo was evacuated and the base was put on alert, there was little that could be done to prevent the missile from exploding. The second tragedy that day came when the Air Force refused to admit it had a problem, even to the vice president who happened to be in Little Rock at the time. Shortly after the 2 intrepid technicians entered the base, the silo exploded with such force that it threw the nuclear warhead through the concrete blast door atop the silo. The non-nuclear explosion resulted in 1 dead and 20 injured. Fortunately, The warhead was recovered in a ditch about a quarter of a mile away, dented but intact. Since then, there have been many broken arrows that occurred on both sides of the Atlantic. When it comes to the U.S. arsenal, even in the 21st century, we're not without sin. The hard part is trying to ferret out the incidents using the Freedom of Information Act, which unfortunately takes time. The question is, how much time we all have when it's clear all it would take to cause a disaster of unimaginable proportions would be to have just one broken arrow go thermonuclear on home soil. How much longer our luck can hold out is anybody's guess. Let me know what you think with your comments. If you thought this video was thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell.